Right, so this time we're looking at the early modern period. I mean, we've been looking at it for a few weeks. We've been looking at case studies like witchcraft, like the Gunpowder Plot, but we're zoning right into those three key things: policing, trials, and punishments. And we're specifically going to look and think about how much things might have changed from the Middle Ages, which is obviously what the whole course is about. How much did things change? When did they change? Why did they change? And here is key thing number one. The power of religion, the role of the church, was quite substantial. It's quite big in the Middle Ages. You might remember doing about the benefit of the clergy, the sanctuary, trial by blessed bread, things that we looked at in the Middle Ages that you've written about recently in your work. Well, the church declined in power in the early modern period, and it coincides with what was going on in history. This is why I was telling you about Henry VIII and how he made himself head of the church, and there was a Protestant Catholic business throughout the period. So the power of the church generally declined, and so their control over law and order also declined, and into its place, gaining more power, was the king's authority, or royal authority, because of course there were queens at the time. So royal authority at the time was a thing that increased because they introduced certain things. The court system, for example, was a bit more standardised, I would say, if I was a top grade student. You've got the manor courts to deal with the lower crimes. Then if you've done something a little bit more serious, it goes up to the quarter sessions, which is sort of in the county. And that's what the quarter sessions, how many times a year do you think they happened? 4 times. And for the really serious offences, you've got the county assizes, which is where the royal judges would turn up and deal with the really serious stuff. So yeah, that's a decent development. You know, different levels of court depending on how serious the crimes were. You've also got justices of the peace. So they were people who were an important part of law and order. They were always powerful people, huge landowners, who took the job because of the power and prestige they got. You know, they got power because they had some control over law and order. They would judge on the manor courts. They had the power to fine people, put them in the stocks or the pillory, order them to be whipped. So they've got a lot of power. And this is why they took over doing this sort of thing. And also, they had the constable to assist them as well. So just as the peace is a new thing. Constables aren't. They were around in the Middle Ages. In the towns, well, hue and cry still existed in the country, but it wasn't really effective in the towns. So they employed town watchmen and sergeants in the towns who would patrol the streets during the day and the night. They didn't get paid very much. They weren't particularly of much use, but they did wander up and down the streets trying to keep the peace. They had to arrest drunks and vagabonds. They were actually allowed to peep into people's windows to check they were not up to anything. And maybe their biggest job was to go to the market, which was the most important day in any town, and to check that the people selling things were not breaking the law. So they were enforcing market regulations, you would say. So that if they were saying they were selling a certain weight of something, they'd be checking it. If they were looking for counterfeit goods, which was a really serious crime, and that sort of thing, just keeping an eye on the market. So yeah, the town watchmen and sergeants was a bit of a change. Back to the church, benefit of the clergy still existed. You might remember by the end of the Middle Ages, things were getting a bit ridiculous when anybody was saying benefit of the clergy, because it was more lenient in the church courts, which also still existed. And they were able to claim benefit of the clergy if they could read a verse from the Bible, which became known as the neck verse, because if you didn't read it, you'd get hanged. And you know, people cotton on to this, like, this is ridiculous. So in the 1600s, the law was changed, which prevented people, unless they were actually part of the clergy, from claiming benefit of the clergy. So there's an example of how the church decreases in importance. And there we go. And a new thing was habeas corpus to the later part of the early modern period. It sounds quite fancy, but basically it was an act that was passed, the Habeas Corpus Act, which meant you couldn't lock somebody up without charging them for a crime. So they had to have done something, they had to appear in court and be accused of a crime, because what was happening before, people could just be chucked in a prison. That's it. What's my crime? I'll decide that in a minute. This time you have to say what their crime is, and they have to be put onto trial within a certain amount of time. What it didn't stop is governments sticking people in prison and making up a crime for them to be there. But at least it's a step in the right direction. In terms of punishments, well, as capital punishment, whipping, stocks and pillories, things that we've seen before, but there are a couple of new things, like transportation. British Empire was growing. We were controlling places around the world. So one thing you could do with criminals is just ship them to another place. And a popular place at this time in the early modern period was America. Ship them off to America, drop them off there, and they're not a problem to us anymore. You also had a new thing which was houses of correction. So think like a house to correct your behaviour if you're a particular type of criminal, that may be a vagabond or some repeat offenders who need correcting, and they would sometimes be whipped, but they would just do hard, back-breaking, terrible jobs that you wouldn't want to do all day long, and they're supposed to be teaching them the value of hard work. So there we go, policing, trials, crimes and some on punishments. What I've missed, before I go, the Bloody Code in 1688, so just before the end of the early modern period. A number of crimes were given the death penalty for. So it was increased a bit. It was a change to the law so you could get the death penalty for more crimes. And that means the number of people being executed rose in the late early modern period and then into the next period, which we're about to look at in a little while. So there we go.